Okay, and we're back with part two. I apologize. I had some minor technical difficulties there, so if you saw me sort of like fading off, I was trying to figure out what was going on with the wires down on my table. But I think we're all plugged in and we're recording correctly again. So let's pick it up where we left off. I talked briefly about the Northwest Ordinance, one of the only good things to come out of the Articles of Confederation. That was 1787. Uh, and I talked about some problems with it, the Articles of Confederation, but let's talk about them in a little more details. The Articles were really trash. They did not work well. For one, you needed a unanimous vote to do anything, which meant each state sent one person up to the Congress, and all 13 of them needed to vote for anything to move. Congress couldn't raise taxes or make money of its own, so all the states had to raise taxes for it, had to beg them for money. That didn't work out too good. State governments were dominated by their legislatures. States traditionally, in the colonial times, didn't like their governors a lot because they'd often be royally appointed, whereas you could pick your legislatures, so the legislatures tend to be overpowered. And weak national government had a difficult time standing up to a foreign power. So in secret, a bunch of unelected dudes, wealthy, powerful dudes, that we now call the Founding Fathers, went off and met and did a constitutional convention and agreed that all deliberations would be secret, talk about trashing the Articles of Confederation and creating a new constitution. At this convention, they had to ask themselves many questions. One was, how much power do we give to the people? They wanted to stick with the principle from the Declaration of Independence that government answers to the people, but they knew that if you gave too much power directly to the people, that could lead to chaos. So a lot of how they dealt with things was through a system of filtration, otherwise known as indirect elections. You vote for someone who votes for someone, right? And the idea was that hopefully local people would vote for someone educated to make the hard decision for who should actually sit in the office. So if you think back to the original Constitution, the only spot where you got anyone, by back then it would have had to have been a landowning white man, 21 years of age or older, who had enough land. If you could do that and go vote, they only let you vote for your representative in the House of Representatives. You could not vote for your senator. Why? Because the U.S. senators were picked by state legislatures, although you could vote for your state legislature. So that's a filtered position, right? You vote for your state legislation. Your state legislature later goes ahead and votes for your U.S. senator. You don't get to vote for them directly. That changed with the 17th Amendment, but until 1914, so from 1789 till 1914, that was the rule. State legislatures picked U.S. senators. What is something else we can talk about? Indirect elections. Think about the president. To this day, you don't get to directly elect the president, right? You get to elect an elector. And then that elector meets in the state capitol at the Electoral College to sign electoral votes. Those votes all get shipped to Washington, D.C. and counted on a date like January 6th, where you all might have noticed there's this whole thing where the House and Senate have to meet in the House chambers in a joint session of Congress. And in that joint session of Congress, they take these electoral votes that have been certified in state capitals, from sea to shining sea, and they pull out those certified votes and they read them as certified and log them in, and they count the votes. And today there are 538 electoral votes and 270 sufficient to secure one, the presidency of the United States. That's how filtered and indirect elections work. There's a second debate going on about how strong do we want this national government. We want it stronger than the Articles of Confederation. But we also want state governments to retain some power and local governments to retain some power. Madison's plan shifted power into a strong national government. And they're going back and forth, and the compromise they find is federalism, right? So I want to talk about alternatives to federalism just so you can see the difference here. A unitary state is something like France. There is only one central government, and local government exists to carry out the orders of that central government. So if the Prime Minister of France wants something to get done, he can simply order the mayors of the several hundred municipalities of France to go ahead and carry it out, and the mayors report up to the minister, and they do what they're supposed to do. In a confederation, the smaller units of government are more powerful, right? So the EU you might think of as a modern-day confederation, but even if you want to think of the U.S. under the Articles of Confederation, the states were the only one who could raise taxes or coin money. You had to ask the states for everything. The states were where the law ultimately stopped, and they just sort of had a loose-bound little federal body, confederal body for delegated authority. It wasn't overarching them. It was just sort of a convenience thing where we will bind together for certain activities. The compromise they forged is federalism, which is a system in which the larger national government and the smaller subunit governments, like states, are essentially co-equal and co-sovereign. So some functions go to the federal government, some functions go to state government, but governors don't exist to carry out the will of the president. In fact, governors are allowed to totally dislike the president. The orders don't flow downhill like that. The governments are just layered on top of each other. The third thing they argued about was how to set up the government, the federal government. And there were three kind of plans going on here. The first plan was the big state plan. There was a Virginia plan. It called for a bicameral legislation, which we have now, right? We have a House of Representatives and the Senate. But it called for both to be based on population. Right now, only our House of Representatives is based on population. The Senate's based on states. In this plan, Congress would elect the president, not the Electoral College. They'd establish national courts, and Congress would legislate in cases where the states were incompetent. So the feds had quite a bit more power in a way in that plan. The New Jersey plan was significantly different. It was for a unicameral legislature, like the Articles of Confederation. Each state would have one vote. Congressional acts would be the law of the land. Congress would elect an executive committee. So remember, out of Congress, they would pick an executive committee. That committee would select a Supreme Court. And that committee would basically serve as, you can think of it like the prime minister and other ministers in the parliamentary system today. And the national government could tax the states. Connecticut comes up with a compromise between these two views, which is what we have today. Okay? A bicameral Congress with a House of Representatives based on population and a Senate where you get 2 members from each state, period. The president exists as an individual. There was a lot of argument maybe we should have had 2 presidents like the Romans had 2 consuls. Or maybe we should have had a team of people act as the president. But in the end, they decided, no, it's best to have one person making decisions. The president will serve a 4-year term and be elected by the Electoral College. They put all that into Section 2. They invent separation of powers as we know it today, and they give Congress the legislative power, the presidency the executive power, and the courts the judicial power. And they give them checks and balances. So each one of the 3 branches gets to get up in the other one's business just a little bit. So, for example, the president can veto legislation. So the president's not in Congress. The president is only supposed to execute the laws, not make the laws. And yet, the president has the power to take a law that was passed through the Senate and the House, unanimously even, they're happy about it, and just veto it so it doesn't become law. Now, they get a chance to override his veto, and if 2/3 of them in each chamber want to do that, they can override the president. However, that happens very rarely. So everyone's in kind of everyone else's business there, right? The Congress can pick the Supreme Court. The president can nominate members that Congress can consider for the Supreme Court. So actually, the president gets the first pick. The Congress just gets to screen with advice and consent in the Senate. So the court doesn't get to pick its own members, right? Everyone's up in everyone else's business. That kind of checks and balances is really the most distinctive feature of the U.S. Constitution. So this, as you might know or recognize, an electoral college map of the 2020 presidential election. And I think you can see, states that are blue are won by Biden, states that were red were won by Trump. And you can see that other than Nebraska and Maine, every state decided to do their electoral college winner take all. So each state sends all of its electoral votes, and D.C. sends its 3 electoral votes for either one candidate or the other, except for Maine and Nebraska, who split them up. Now, how do they determine how many electoral votes each state gets every 4 years? After the census, on every 0 year, they do what's called reapportionment. They count up the entire population of the United States and of each state. They divide it out by 435, which is the number of representatives we capped the chamber at back about 100 years ago. And they figure out how many representatives each state should get. Then they add 2, 1 for each senator. And that is how you get the number of electoral votes. So if you're not sure, you can go, oh, California has 55. They have 2 senators. That means they should have 53 representatives in Congress, in the House of Representatives. Wow, that's a lot. But a lot of people live in California. That makes sense. Or you can look at Alaska and say, wow, they only get 3. 2 for the senators and then only 1 for a representative. That means that, wow, there must be under 1 million people living in Alaska. Wow, really nobody lives there. And that would also be true. Now, what happens with Maine and Nebraska? Maine and Nebraska run it by congressional district, and if you win a congressional district for your candidate, you get the electoral vote from that district. Maine has 2 districts and 2 senators. Nebraska has 3 districts and 3 senators. In Nebraska, Biden won 1 district and lost the other 2. In Maine, Trump won 1 district and lost the other 1. And if there's a tie like that, they look at the whole vote count for the state, and they see which direction it went. Maine went blue, Nebraska went red. So the 2 senators and the district that voted blue all go to the Democrats in Maine, whereas the the 2 senators and the 3 representatives who voted who were Republicans in Nebraska go to the Electoral College for Nebraska. So Nebraska sends 1 Democrat, 5 Republicans, and Maine sends 3 Democrats, 1 Republican. You guys can go back and look more closely at this table later. I talked to you about a lot of this, vetoes, veto overrides, how the checks and balances work. It's just a nice little graphic to make it clear in your head. So if hearing me drone on and on is not your favorite way to learn, and students, I know you all learn differently, right? I know some of you are auditory learners. Some of you could just listen to this like a podcast, and that would be the best thing for you. Some of you are very visual learners, and this type of graphic is going to help you out. So take a look at this if you're a visual learner, and say, oh, well, I see what he was talking about now. Okay, I get it. As we're moving on, there are more compromises that happen. 2 more big ones. One is called the 3/5 compromise, and that's what's right here. The big argument was over slavery. The northern states had already all rejected slavery. It was over, or on its way out, if not totally over. Everywhere north of the Mason-Dixon line, which is the southern border of Pennsylvania. The southern states obviously still widely practiced slavery, and it's a big part of the southern economy. So they had to figure out, like, how do we work together on this? And one of the problems that the North had was, well, if we count slaves in the census as whole people, regular citizens, then every slave owner is going to get an extra vote for every slave they own. And that is going to be bad. It's going to give disproportionate power to people where it shouldn't. Only free men should be able to vote, said folks in the North, for the most part, at the Constitutional Convention. In the South, on the other hand, they wanted those extra votes, right? So they were arguing for slaves to count as a whole person. The compromise was this 3/5 compromise, where each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a vote. So that happened. There was a second compromise, where in Article 1, Section 8, the powers of Congress are listed. One of the powers the North really wanted Congress to have was the power to regulate commerce. That's the power to regulate business. The South did not want them to have that power. The compromise they made was that the South could continue to import slaves for 20 more years until 1808, but in exchange, the North could have the Commerce Clause, which is the only law today that makes the Civil Rights Act work and makes it so that it's illegal to ban people of a certain race from your hotel or theater or restroom or whatever. And finally, the one final bit that had to be included there, the South wasn't going to sign on board, was the Fugitive Slave Clause, which essentially said that Congress should pass laws dealing with fugitive slaves, and they should be sent back to their state of origin if they escape to free states. This is part of the reason why a big chunk of Harriet Tubman's, say, Underground Railroad was trying to get slaves all the way up to Canada for freedom, right? There would have been no slavery in, say, upstate New York at the time, for the most part. That had gone way, way by the wayside by the Civil War. However, because of the Fugitive Slave Clause, we'd have a Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that would actually potentially criminally fine or worse Northern police if they didn't actively go and hunt down slaves reportedly stolen by Southern slave owners. So this really created a lot of tension and problems. There's an overview of the Constitution here, and I think what I am going to do is I'm going to use this. I think this is good, but I'm going to skip forward. I have my own overview, and I want to talk you through that, okay? So we're going to skip forward here. This is my overview. Pretty similar to the one the book has, but I think this is easier to remember, and I do it in time. So I think there are three main parts of the Constitution: the preamble, the 7 articles, and the 27 amendments. The preamble is we the people, right? In order to form a more perfect union, we're doing 6 things. What are we doing? We're forming a more perfect union. We're ensuring domestic tranquility. We're providing for the common defense and the blessings of liberty. We're securing justice, and we're providing welfare. Those are the 6 things that we say our Constitution is written to do. Now, you might not like one or more of those 6 things. If you're much more conservative, you might not like the idea of welfare. If you're much more liberal, you might not like, maybe think defense is too big, or maybe you're not so huge on how libertarians or wealthy people might define liberty. That's okay. The Constitution was made for all of it. All right? And then 7 articles. The 7 articles establish the shape of the government. The first article is pretty long. It sets forth the legislature. It's going to be bicameral. There'll be a House of Representatives. You have to be at least 25 years of age or older to be a representative. And you have to have been a citizen of the United States for 7 years. There'll also be a Senate. There'll be 2 senators assigned per state. It's going to be the higher, more lofty sort of place. It's supposed to be the best deliberative body in the world. The Senate is a continuing body. This is very important. So repeat after me. The Senate is a continuing body. This means that the Senate's rules persist and go back to 1789. The Senate is a unbreakable line in the Republic. Every 2 years, the House of Representatives dissolves and we get a new Congress. And you can count the Congresses. You can say, oh, that happened back in the 80th Congress. So that just happened in the 116th Congress a couple years ago. You can't count the Senates. There's only been one Senate. Why? Because only 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election at any given time. So the Senate always has a quorum and the Senate rules persist. Every 2 years, the House of Representatives dissolves. A new speaker might come in. They can write a whole new set of rules. And it's sort of blank slate. So the Senate is the through line of the Republic. As long as it survives, the Republic survives. I think that's important to realize, too. Now, the second article establishes the executive. It sets forth the Electoral College. It says there's going to be a president. It says the president is going to serve 4-year terms. It says the president has to be a natural-born citizen. They never define that too carefully. It has to be at least 35 years of age. And it says that the president shall be commander-in-chief and shall faithfully execute the laws of the United States. He'll take an oath, stuff like that. The third article is downright vague. It's judicial. It says that there's going to be a Supreme Court. It's going to have first jurisdiction in matters of certain marine affairs, foreign affairs, issues where the government's directly a plaintiff or a respondent, those type of things. However, what doesn't it tell you? It doesn't tell you what the Supreme Court does. It doesn't tell you if it should have juries. It doesn't even tell you how many Supreme Court justices there should be. It just says Congress can figure all that out, and Congress can invent lower courts as necessary. So it gives a lot of power to Congress to design it, and the Constitution doesn't put a lot of thought in its design. Number 4 of the 7 articles are states. This establishes how states and federal government are supposed to work together. We have something called the Supremacy Clause, where federal and state laws conflict. The federal law is supposed to reign supreme. We have states determining the time, manner, and place of elections, except if Congress shall, regulate that separately from time to time for good reason. We have all this new stuff. So the 5th article is just how you amend the Constitution. There are 2 primary ways, and only one of them's ever been used. The one way that has been used is you get 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to vote on a resolution to amend the Constitution. If you can get 2/3 of each chamber, that resolution does not have to go to the president. It goes to the state legislatures. 3/4 of the state legislatures have to vote to approve that new amendment to the Constitution. And if and when they do, it goes to the National Archivist, who logs it in, and it becomes part of the Constitution. So it's a long process. You can't change the Constitution. You can't change the Constitution, overnight, right? You can't just amend things willy-nilly. 6, this one's a little bit hard to wrap your head around, but there are some other interesting clauses here. States have to give full faith and credit to other states. There has to be continuity in law. The United States is going to honor all the debts from the Articles of Confederation and from before the Articles of Confederation, and honor all the old contracts, and honor all the old law. So we're going to import some ancient British common law through this, but we're going to import a lot of other law through the Article 6. And finally, ratification. They said if 9 of the 13 states want to sign this, then that's good enough. All 13 of them have to join. We don't need permission unanimously. Okay. That's pretty short, right? Those are 7 articles. Then we get the 27 amendments. This is how I remember them. They fall into chunks. The Bill of Rights went with the initial passage of the Constitution. That's 1 through 10. The antebellum amendments, remember, ante, before in Latin, bellum, war, before the war, right, before the Civil War, are 11 and 12. 11 establishes what we call sovereign immunity, which means states have to voluntarily open themselves up to lawsuits. There are some exceptions to that. For instance, you might just have to be a respondent in a complaint from the feds or something like that. But in general, you have to, anyway, in general, states have wide leeway there. So how do these Bills of Rights work? The first one is the 5 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, and finally, freedom of religion, which has 2 parts: a free exercise clause, which says you're allowed to exercise whichever religion you deem fit, and an establishment clause, which says that the federal government should not establish a national religion. Plenty of countries do this, right? Israel says it's a Jewish state. France says it's a Catholic state. The Church of England is sort of the national church of the United Kingdom. We're not allowed to do that in the United States, right? We have to kind of stay away from doing stuff like that. Okay. So the 11th Amendment was sovereign immunity, remember? That was the antebellum amendment that prevented anyone from being able to willy-nilly sue states, or states to willy-nilly sue other states in their own state courts. It just sort of ended all that. Finally, in the antebellum amendments, is the 12th Amendment. That meant that the president could now pick their vice presidential candidate, and they could run on one ticket together. Before that, the person who got the second most electoral votes became president. But I want you to think about this for a minute. If it wasn't for the 12th Amendment, who would be the vice president of the United States right now? If there was no 12th Amendment, the vice president right now would be Donald J. Trump under Joseph R. Biden. And just fewer than 4 short years ago, the president would have been Donald J. Trump, and his vice president would have been Hillary Rodham Clinton. You can see how ridiculous that is, and it was ridiculous early on, too. So they started letting presidents run with vice presidents. So that's it until the Civil War, until 1860s. After the Civil War, there are 3 amendments, and southern states have to sign these kind of at the barrel of a gun to get their spots in the legislature back because they committed treason when they fired on American troops and left the country to try to rebel and form a confederacy. What are those amendments? Those are 13, 14, and 15. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment does a lot of things, but try to remember at least what Section 1 does. 14th Amendment, Section 1, does 4 key things. Number 1, it says that all persons born in the United States or the jurisdiction thereof shall be citizens of the United States and the state in which they reside. That's the citizenship clause. Number 2, it says that no state shall deny any citizen life, liberty, or property. Okay. Privileges and immunities of the law. Okay, that's privileges and immunities clause. Or life, liberty, and property without due process of the law. That's a due process clause. So again, citizenship clause, privileges and immunities clause, due process clause, and finally, nor the equal protection under the law. That's the equal protection clause. We litigate that one a ton now. Why? Because it wasn't there in the beginning, and there are people in this country who I think would like to turn the clock back to before the Civil War sometimes. All right, what are the next chunk? 16 to 19 in World War I rather. This is because we needed money to fund the war. So 16 was income tax. That created the first, not the first. The first income tax was Lincoln during the Civil War. This was the first broad-based income tax, though. Let's see. 17 allowed you to directly elect senators, so that would no longer be a filtered or indirect election. State legislators would no longer get the chance to do that themselves. You got to vote as a citizen for which senator you wanted, as long as you were male, until 1920, after the 19th Amendment was ratified. And the 19th Amendment gave universal women's suffrage. So now, by 1920, women can vote. And that is a big, big shift. Coming around to 1922, coming around to the 20th to 22nd Amendment, these are the World War II amendments. The 20th Amendment moves the start date of the presidency back to January 20th. Why January 20th of the years after their election? You need some time to transfer all of government from one person in cabinet to another, right? Usually all new people are coming in on the top. So you need some time to brief them about what's going on and figure all that stuff out. Get your personal papers out, right? Get anything secret out of your house. Figure everything out. We used to give them all the way to March to do that. It ended up being trouble. The Civil War kicked off during that time. January 6th happened during that time. That period between the election and when somebody actually takes office, the longer it gets, I think, the more dangerous it gets. So, what else do we have here? The 21st Amendment repeals the 18th Amendment. Now, I didn't talk much about the 18th Amendment because we were getting here, but the 18th Amendment, way back before women got the right to vote, in the late 19-teens, prohibited alcohol. And all through the 1920s, alcohol was illegal in this country, until you get to Roosevelt, and FDR in 1933, brings that back with the 21st Amendment, which repeals prohibition and makes alcohol legal again. Finally, after FDR died after running for 4 terms, it started to make people nervous that somebody that popular could happen who would want to run for 4 terms. Even though most people thought he did a good job, they thought that, Washington stepped down after 2. That should be kind of the rule. So what did they do there? Something pretty simple. They just said, all right, you're going to get 2 terms max. And if you take over halfway through a term, it can be max 10 years. So that is what the World War II generation bills were about. If you move forward These ones are from the 1960s and to an extent with the later ones, the 70s. This is all about civil rights and stuff. So let's walk through it. 23rd Amendment provides 3 electoral votes for Washington, D.C. Washington's D.C. back then was a majority black city. It's still a plurality black city almost. Not quite. I mean, it's still 40-something% black, I would say. But, nevertheless, that's the case for D.C. Finally, they get to vote for president, and they get 3 electoral votes to do so. They get an observer in the House of Representatives. They don't actually get a seat in the House of Representatives. They have a mayor, but the U.S. Congress technically controls all their lives and a lot of city stuff. So there's a real weird relationship there because it's not a state. It's just a District of Columbia. But it's nice, even if they can't have senators or reps, to at least be able to vote for president. The 24th Amendment prohibits poll tax. Poll tax was largely a way southern states would disenfranchise poor people, particularly poor black people. They would ask them to pay a tax to get in the voting booth. That tax could have been $20, which would have been incredibly difficult to find back then. And it was their way of stopping people from voting. So that gets tucked in the Constitution. Like I said, is Amendment 24. So you have 23, 3 electoral votes for D.C., 24, you have poll tax prohibited. 25 is in response to JFK getting assassinated. You might remember that happened at the Dallas parade there in November 22nd, 1963. So after JFK gets assassinated, they stop and think to themselves, well, what if he didn't die? What if he just turned into a vegetable? Would we still have to answer him as president if he was mentally incapacitated? Or what if they got Lyndon Johnson too? What if they killed the president and the vice president on the same day? It's not really clear all the way down who takes over. So the 25th Amendment makes a line of succession. It basically goes president, vice president, speaker of the House, Senate president pro tem, and then the cabinet secretaries in the order that they started. So you get Janet Yellen as Secretary of Treasury, Lloyd Austin as Secretary of Defense, which used to be Secretary of War, and Anthony Blinken as Secretary of State nowadays, which is still Secretary of State. And Janet Yellen, rather, is the Secretary of Treasury, right? So the 3 originals are Treasury, War, and State. Finally, the 26th Amendment provides for universal suffrage for people 18 to 21 years old. This is in part a backlash to the Vietnam War, right? Young people were getting sick of being drafted and not being able to vote. Then the 27th Amendment. Here's the story behind that. Madison, when he drafted the Bill of Rights, originally wrote 12 amendments. One of them would have increased the size of the House of Representatives in proportion to the population and had a pretty complex math formula for how he would add seats every year or two. In reality, that never actually came to fruition like that. So that bill never, that amendment, even though it passed Congress, never gets signed or ratified into law. Finally, the second one of the 12 that we don't talk about a lot is the one that is here, which bans Congress people from voting for their own pay raise. But they can vote for a pay raise that takes place in the next Congress. And if it happens, you get your same job back again. Well, now you find a back way into it, right? But make no mistake, it's a little bit weird. People being proud of having permission to eat their car and stuff. And taking victory laps for, kind of a strangely minor impeachment purpose. Okay, so, we did that. We did all of it, right? So what I've done here is I sort of broke these down into how I remember them. I hope this helps you remember them. I remember them with just a word or two a lot of times. And then after I've read the Constitution enough, the word triggers my mind. I can say the whole sentence. So I'm going to ask you guys to all read the Constitution. Okay? I want you to read it, and I want you to read it along with this video and the video that precedes this. So, there'll be 2 total videos for about an hour. I want you to check them out. I want you to read Chapter 2. I want you to read the U.S. Constitution itself. And I want you to be prepared for like a mini quiz on what the Constitution is and what's in it and what it does and what it doesn't. All right, so I'm about to upload this to YouTube. I will send you some information on how to view it, and we'll get all that going presently. I will talk to you next week, and I hope you have a wonderful February 7th.